Okay, let's begin this class. I want to welcome everyone to the class on Ellen and Bill laws. This was postponed from original schedule April the 7th, and it is part of the 200th anniversary celebration of First Presbyterian Church. I am Janet Lowery, and I did not know the Reverend Dr. William Laws Jr., but I did meet him in 1973 at a presbytery function in Bloomington, Indiana, because he was on the ordination committee for my former husband. So when he was ordained, that's when I met Bill. I did know Ellen Laws pretty well. She was a constant support during my life in my time here as associate pastor for this congregation, which was from 1987 to 99. I considered her a role model for grace and faith and partnership in ministry. And just now, I'll apologize that not enough time this morning will focus on her, because I truly believe that much of Bill's effectiveness as an ordained minister was made possible and strongly influenced by Ellen. So why is this the Laws Room? Why is there a Laws Lodge on the campus of Louisville Seminary? Why is there a Laws Peacemaking Lecture Series? Why is there William R. Laws Scholarship or Foundation in the community? Why does the Human Rights Commission have a Laws Award? And this year's recipient will be Pastor Felipe. So what goes around comes around, right? Many don't know the background, and that's why we're having this class. So let me start with basics. William Laws was born on August the 18th, 1916 in Durham, North Carolina. He was a 1938 graduate of Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina, which is a Presbyterian college. So I'm going to make the assumption that he, coming from North Carolina, lots of Presbyterians there, that he was raised as a Presbyterian. After college, he became a member of the faculty at Cumberland Hunt Military Academy in Port Gibson, Mississippi. And he taught English and Latin there for 2 years. Then I don't know the details, but he had a call to ministry, which took him to Louisville Presbyterian Seminary from 1940 to 1943. And you know what was going on in the United States during those years. It was during the World War II. He was a 1943 graduate of that seminary, and he married Ellen Davis on May the 15th, 1943 in Louisville. Now, she had been born in Louisville in 1910, so she was senior to him by 5 or 6 years. She already had a master's degree and was a Christian education director at Second Presbyterian Church in Louisville. Well, I suggest it was a match made in heaven. After marriage, Ellen then taught elementary school, and Bill was called to pastor Bushel Presbyterian Church in Kentucky. He served there from 1943 through 1950, 7 years. Then, according to a Republic News article dated January the 30th, 1950, the Presbyterians fill a pastoral vacancy. That's when you got a headline in the local newspaper. And the Reverend Laws was unanimously elected when he spoke 2 weeks ago and was given approval by the congregation. So this is a whole article, and there are some nice archives in our local library. The Reverend and Mrs. Laws have 2 children, Margaret, 5, and Anne, 3.5. The family will occupy the Presbyterian Manse, which is located at the corner of 11th and Franklin Streets in the near future. So think about the 1950s. The churches were growing everywhere, and at that time you got 2 for 1. The pastor's wife was assumed to be part of the pastoral team. Think what the United States was like. On one hand, the Cold War, racial and political division, a ton of tension. And on the other hand, it was the good old days when the baby boomers were born. Yay. Marty Allmeyer is the daughter who survives in the family, and she sends flowers annually to worship service here. And I requested, and she sent a very nice letter. So this is Marty speaking. I was 5 years old when our family moved from Kentucky to Columbus and into the manse. It was a very big, kind of storybook house. I loved it, and I still think of it often. It had a small kitchen with an eat-in area, and I often have wondered how on earth my mom was able to prepare so many wonderful meals for so many people with so little counter space. The manse was a busy place. There were lots of meetings, meals, and gatherings. My dad often had a men's morning breakfast. There were evening Bible and book study group meetings. He liked to have meetings in the manse, so he would be home in the evenings. Sunday almost always meant guests for Sunday dinner. Mom often did not know who they would be, as Daddy would invite folks at church. It was a different era in the sense that the manse was owned by the church, and it was viewed as an extension of the church property. So there was no laws room at that time. This was offices over on that edge and a second floor in here and Sunday school classrooms above. There was no building on the other side of the gymnasium. So a lot of programming happened at 11th and Franklin. My dad was on several community committees, so guests and interviewees sometimes came for dinner, such as the sculptor who did one sculpture for Parkside School. And sometimes the large dining room table was busy and full of Mom's materials for Women's Association. Upstairs guest bedrooms saw lots of comings and goings too. Sometimes young people in our congregation who were having troubles at home stayed in our house. There were 2 year-long American Friends Service students, one from Indonesia and one from Peru. There was a gentleman from the Middle East who was trying to get established in Columbus, and 2 Vietnamese young men who were students at Indiana University. The back bedrooms sometimes held a stranger who needed temporary housing, and the one I remember was a straggly-looking fellow who came on my birthday. So, the life of the family. Yes.
Janet, if you can, ask her if Louis Armstrong stayed in their house. There's a rumor that he could not stay. It's not a rumor. He couldn't stay in a hotel in town when he performed here. And the rumor is that Dr. Laws hosted him. So if you have a contact with her, ask her if she remembers that. Would have been in the early 60s.
1957.
Sorry, 1957.
Okay, so we have questions for Marty. All right. Now, this next section I'm going to give about 15 minutes to, and it's the early part of his ministry. And this is a comment from John Sawin, Hal Gelfius, Kate Bodorf, and then I'll invite Cal Brand to take the mic for a bit. These were people that knew those early years. John Sawin was not a Presbyterian as a kid, but he remembers Bill speaking at his 8th grade graduation out in one of the schools out and about. And Bill gave a real talk, 3 points. What are you going to do? Who are you going to do it with? And what are you going to worship? And if you could remember those 3 things, when you graduated from high school, Bill would give you a milkshake. So that started the relationship where John Sawin's dad worked for Cummins, and he was going to middle school here, the old Central. And so what he would do is walk by here every day and often stop in and chat with Bill, whose office was right there. And of course, he remembered the 3 points. He did get the milkshake, and that was a highlight of his young life. And like I said, the Solomons weren't Presbyterians, but John started coming to youth group, and Bill Loss said, "You and Nancy courted in the manse, during youth group," and Nancy wasn't a Presbyterian either. So when they got married, they had to decide where they were going to go to church, and they had agreed they wouldn't go where either of their parents were, which was Grace Lutheran, and fortunately, Fairlawn had begun, and the Solomons had been part of the seed group for the new Fairlawn Presbyterian Church. So that meant that John and Nancy could join here. So that's that story. And Ted Sharp still tells a story about Sherm bringing them to the breakfast group at the manse. And they were getting into a big discussion about fly fishing. And how good fish would be. And Ellen answered from the kitchen, "But I'm not cooking the fish for breakfast." Hal Gelfius tells the story that his family would hunt rabbits, and they would bring dressed rabbits to Bill and Ellen to eat. And one day Bill said, "I'd like to go rabbit hunting with you." So they said, "Sure." So it's Hal and Bill and their rabbit hunting dog and his dad. And it started out a normal event. The first place they stopped was successful. They went on to another place, and the dog, what do you call it, got the rabbits going. And it jumped the fence, and the dog jumped the fence, and they were in somebody's private property, who came out and started cursing at them up and down and up and down. And of course, they're with the pastor, and they're going, "What can we do about this?" And they all lived afterwards, and the owner wouldn't let them have the dog for a long time. So this went on. This is a fuss that Hal remembers pretty well. That anyway, they would also give rabbits to the Lindemans. And of course, we have a Lindemann room upstairs, and they would make, someone can say it better than me, Hoffenpepser, which is something about rabbit stew. It's a German dish. And along the same line, Mary Ann McCrae told me some stories about before they were Presbyterians. In Wisconsin, they would vacation and fish the same places and got to know each other well during vacation time. So my friend Kate would have been here on April the 7th, and I'm sorry she missed out. She came at age 7 to live with her Aunt Mary Bodorf, who was a longtime member of the church. So Kate was here for baptism, for confirmation class. She was in the church choir. She knew Bill really well, and I wish she were here to tell the story. She attended college at DePauw and got married, and somebody who eventually became a minister, had 2 kids, but they divorced. And Kate came back with her family to Columbus for a while, and Bill helped her get on her feet. And in fact, this church paid for Kate's tuition to Louisville Presbyterian Seminary. And Kate is one of the children of the church who went into the ministry, and has a lot of fond memories of Bill and his encouragement in what was for her a very difficult time. Okay, Cal, I'm going to give Cal the mic, and
Give him
2 mics. Okay. Yes. We're technically advanced. Have a seat.
You got it. Thank you. So your sermon, by the way, just really connected with the last couple of days as I was preparing, because I have this deep sense of gratitude for all of the mentors that have planted seeds that I've delighted to see grow. We moved up from Seymour in 1949 when I was 7, just before Bill started, but he's the only pastor I remember. I don't know who was here. I mean, I can go up and look on the pictures, but I don't have any idea. And so the first interaction, formal, that I had with Bill was being confirmed in 1954 with the rest of my confirmation class. And that was a significant event, especially back then when you didn't take communion until you were confirmed. And that was neat. Although I was happy to vote in favor of opening the table to kids when that time came. We appreciated his frequent visits to the Westminster Fellowship, both to visit and to teach. One of the things I recall him sharing with us was that God doesn't interfere with secondary causes, apparently from our Constitution. The point being, if you move into an area and cut all the trees down and build your village on the side of the river, God's not going to stop it from flooding you out. And this kind of thing goes on all the time, sadly. But it made an impression, it's still with me. He also led the way to get our youth group up to Indianapolis to see Porgy and Bess, which was a great trip and very educational. It was a dimension of life that none of us had any idea about. And it was also so well done and beautiful. He also explained the importance of the ecumenical movement, using the metaphor of folks from all traditions around a table sharing their vision or understanding of God, since none of us have the full picture. And even then, we don't get the full picture, but we get a richer picture. During this time, he was providing effective leadership toward integration, and I was able to put my name on a sheet of members who agreed to make up the lost business of any barber who opened the shop. That was a big moment for a little kid. Well, I was about 13, I guess, when that happened. He also made frequent reference to his sadness that our church was divided north and south. I believe it was in 1963, as I was a senior at Hanover and feeling a call to ministry, that he had me attend a session meeting where I came under care of the session and received a recommendation to the Indianapolis Presbytery, which subsequently took me under care. Then I was off to Princeton, having accepted the vocation of marriage with Donna. We were married by her pastor down in Anchorage, Kentucky, but Ted Hunt came to play the organ for us. It was a tumultuous time. And when we came home for visits, I usually spent some time at 11th and Franklin with Bill. I recall two in particular, one in which he shared what he understood to be the three great perils I would face if I became a minister. They were time, sex, and money. Yeah. No one would keep time on me as a minister. I would be permitted to be places, private places, that nobody else could be. And finally, people would be trying to give me gifts that I needed to pay attention to. Anyway, the second one had to do with my growing disillusion with our church's delay in responding to the race, gender, and war tensions in our society in the 60s. He encouraged me to be patient, not to jump ship. That was the expression he used, was not to jump ship. Within a few weeks, remarkably, the Presbyterian Church adopted the Confession of 67, which clearly addressed these troubles with emphasis on reconciliation. I don't know if he was prescient or something, how he knew that might happen, but it was a good thing. Bill Laws presided at my ordination here in June of 68, which felt like a special graduation after 20 years growing up here. Finally, in some ways, most importantly, serving as pastor to the McIntosh Presbyterian Church in Central Florida. I was a member of the southern branch of the church. By providence, I was elected to serve as a commissioner to the General Assembly of 1983, which was paired with the northern branch. I was honored to vote in favor of reunion. Afterward, I saw Bill and Ellen outside, and with very happy handshake could acknowledge this fulfillment of a dream. It was the last time I saw either of them. In terms of legacy, I consider myself in some ways as a Law's legacy. I don't have exact numbers, but I carried gospel of love and reconciliation to well over 500 spiritual caregivers, pastors, priests, sisters, rabbis, cantors, seminary students, fruit of this church and the care of Bill Laws. I can't find it. Thank you.
Well said.
And I've just been so blessed by mentors. After I left here and got to Hanover, Princeton, and other places. Anyway, very thankful.
Okay, so you got a nice picture there. What I did interview a few people, and one was Jim Henderson, because I wanted to know about the relationship with J. Irwin Miller and Bill Laws. So this is kind of a piece of that interview. So Jim Henderson came to Columbus in 1964 in order to be an assistant to J. Irwin Miller. And through that, he encountered Bill Laws because J. Irwin Miller and Bill had a lot of mutual respect. They were both intelligent. They were both engaged in a lot of theological discussions of the times. They were interested in the church and world affairs and how those two would fit together. So it was very much a focus on applied faith. So Jim got to be on, Jim asked Bill which church they should join. And Bill said, don't join the church where they ask you to join, use your own mind and figure it out. And of course, J. Irwin Miller was over at the Christian church. So anyway, we got Jim into it. And Jim eventually was on session, and he would travel back and forth with Bill and got to know him very well and got to hear the thoughts being. He would say Miller and Laws were united in service. The focus was there's a reason that people are on earth, and there were opportunities to given to all of us to serve, and that the world was changing, and the church needed to be out in the front, part of the leadership of that. And what Jim observed is that Bill was very adept at asking questions and then listening and then asking follow-up questions, really focusing on the speaker. And would often say, what are we missing when we don't have diversity? So it was a shared approach, and Cummins at that time was working also on the race issues. Now remember, this is the 60s, so it's important, and our news, televisions and papers are filled with what's going on in other parts of the country, but right here in our own back door, as Cal alluded to, if you were an African-American man, you couldn't get your hair cut here in town. Well, that became a priority and a real change, so that there was conversation about housing. I'm going to refer to that just a little bit later, more about that. So pay attention is what Jim got from his time with Bill. Be faithful to Scripture. Understand why people think the way they do. And Bill was a huge reader. He read the priests that were in Latin America. He read any current theology that was going along. So those discussions in the car were, I think, church for Jim Henderson. Okay. Then Ray Hass, who I wish could be here to talk, but he wrote out something for me. Ted Hunt had been the music minister, but he didn't really want to work with children, and education was clearly in the life of children in the church was clearly something Presbyterians were emphasizing and exploring. So here's Ray talking. I was a Master of Sacred Music degree candidate at Union Theological Seminary of Sacred Music in New York City. That school doesn't exist anymore. It moved to Yale. But in the spring of 1961, Bill Laws and George Newland hitched a ride on the Cummins plane to come interview graduating master's degree students. And the question that Bill asked was, what would you do if you had an alcoholic in your choir? That's not the question that Ray expected, but he says, evidently I answered it okay because I got the job. This was typical of the questions Bill often asked people. Not usually easy or comfortable questions, but questions that cut through the veneer and superficial and went straight to the heart of an issue. I agree with Erwin Miller, who said that Bill was, quote, not always a comfortable friend or pastor. Bill Laws was a big man, 6'4" inches. He cast a big shadow, and for a young music graduate in his first full-time job, it was not an easy shadow to stand in, simply because Bill had set the bar so high for himself and therefore for others around him. He was a large man in many ways. His genuine compassion and shepherding nature, not only for his flock, but for all people, was apparent. His office door was always open to anyone, and he often went extra miles to help even a stranger. He was big in his daring and prophetic social leadership in the community. Says Ray, I'll never forget the barber, Lowell Cookie, as people called him, and Bill convincing him to cut black men's hair in his shop so they wouldn't have to go to Indianapolis or Louisville. He led others in convincing the realty owners to sell property anywhere in town to minority people. Cummins was a big force in this, but he led the church and others in resettling several refugee families here, and some might remember the Cuban Martinez family, a couple Vietnamese families that the church helped settle. The pastoral need and Bill's pastoral nature were united when he was elected moderator, and I'm going to do a whole section on the moderator. So Bill Laws was a big man, a man I am richer for having known and worked with, this church the richer for having been pastored by him, and this community the richer for his presence and leadership. So I interviewed both Ray and Betty remembered when they first came, they just lived a few blocks away from the Laws, and how Betty really appreciated meals that they had there. Their girls and the Laws girls knew each other, and when Bill would encourage Ray to continue his education, so they would go to Westminster Choir College, which was in Princeton, New Jersey, for a couple weeks in the summertime. And Bill arranged for their housing by finding a mission worker who, was going to be gone for a while, and they could mow the grass and stay there for not much. And Ellen would pack them food and things for the children to play in the car while they're driving to and fro to Princeton, New Jersey. So the families were very supportive of one another. And also Ray pointed out all the work that went into starting Fairlawn. and that it was not a split, but that the church was growing and there were well over 600 members. So there were no other churches at that time out on the east side, and it made a lot of sense. But Ray, and I emphasize this and put an exclamation point, 11 of the church choir members left. Yeah. So I don't know if you've seen this book, Legendary Locals of Columbus, but it's available at Viewpoint and some other places. And there's a nice entry for Bill Laws. During the 26 years in which Bill Laws served as pastor, this is a reminder, Columbus was much smaller, less diverse, and it has changed greatly during those 26 years. And that's what I remember Bill Laws saying this, and I don't know how I heard it, well, anyway. He could stay as long as he did because the community and the church kept changing. So he was always learning new, and then the challenges were new. He believed that a pastor should speak about social issues of the time, even if it made people uncomfortable. So Reverend Laws worked with the microbiologist Mickey King, who became a member, his family were members of the congregation, attorney Lee Hamilton, who later became congressman and much respected Lee Hamilton, and others to encourage realtors to sell homes, because Mickey couldn't buy a home in town and had to live in an apartment for a while, and finally they got some of those things changed. So that's the article in there, and I noticed that there was a nice article also about Mickey King, and Sherman Jackie Franz are on the other side, and also an article about Lee Hamilton. So this is a fun resource. Ray also pointed out that Bill loved to tease and had a good sense of humor, kind of, but it irritated Ray because Bill would pull out his shirt tail, and that's probably like, lighten up. I mean, I can imagine how that went around. All right. Also, talking to Ray and Betty, Ellen was a wonderful hostess. There were gracious dinners on short notice, and she could always put another plate on the table. And Ray was involved with the prayer ministry and the prayer circle, and Ellen was involved, and that was important ministry to them. Okay. Ray had a few things to say about Ed Wycliffe and Jerry Kearns. There was at one time an upside down flag here in Columbus that our church put up. So it didn't stay up very long, but it was controversial. Remember, Bill Law's time here went through the Vietnam War era as well. Okay, I'm going to talk right now about an interview I had with Ben Bush about the time that Bill got elected moderator for the National General Assembly. So it is a moderator for the Northern Church. There really was a Mason-Dixon line, and south of the church, south of the Mason-Dixon line, it was the Southern Church, the PCUS, and up above, it was the United Presbyterian Church of the USA. So he's the moderator of the Northern Church, was elected in 1970. He was one of 5 candidates. He didn't think he was going to get it. He was the dark horse candidate. People hadn't heard of him from Indiana. But Bill had had a sabbatical at San Francisco Seminary a year or two before this whole campaign came up, and spent a lot of that time talking to young seminarians there, being in touch with young people, what was happening around the Vietnam War, and the stretching and the kind of dangers to the church that all this protest and all this dissension was causing. So that's partly what motivated him to run, because the General Assembly in 1970 was the very first time we had youth advisory delegates. And they couldn't vote, but they could speak on the floor. And they changed the way the politicking was done for moderator. Because it used to be, in fact, Ben Bush was on the scene to do the nominating speech. And then there was going to be a second nominating speech. For all these candidates, it's going to eat up a lot of time. And the young people said, no, we want to hear questions. We want discussion. So the nominating speech will be 2 minutes, and the seconding speech will be 1 minute, and then the rest of the time we're going to talk to the moderators. Well, Bill was great. You know, he knew how to listen, how to be engaged in all of that. So this is, I did a little volunteer work for the Presbyterian Historical Society, which is in Philadelphia. And they have a box, a Bill Laws box. I'm going to send some more things to put in it. But this issue from Presbyterian Life was in the box there, and it tells about his stint as moderator. And a lot of these pictures that you've been seeing are him meeting with the young people who were called the submarine church. And as Pat said, they were about as obnoxious as they could be. They were long-haired, so everybody thought they were dirty, you know, that kind of thing. We remember those days. So, but Bill was engaged with them because he knew that they are the church. They are in the church now, and they are the church. They are us. So it was quite an amazing election. And I will say the week, 1 or 2 weeks before, there had been it was in Chicago, and there had been a police riot in Chicago. And so the tensions were really high. And Bill Law's theme through the whole thing was reconciliation through Christ in Jesus, and talking, and embodying the peacemaking that the nation needed at that time. Ben, because of all this work with Bill, got involved with legal matters. He was on the Ben was on the legal council of the National Church in New York City and would go regularly for meetings. I don't know what its name was at that time, yeah. And 4 times a year, Bill would have to go to New York City, which is where the headquarters was at that time for the Northern Church, for the meetings to moderate the meetings to govern the denomination. And William Thompson was the stated clerk then. He was a very strong personality. So Bill got to travel a lot, got to share this message, and he was home not that often to preach. Jerry Kearns, who I don't know if he was assistant or associate, but anyway, he kind of carried the local arrangements. But Bill knew he was invited to the Baltimore Presbytery, and Baltimore Presbytery kind of had a reputation for being confrontational, but a place that wanted to discuss real issues. And Bill was nervous about that and shared that with the congregation here in a sermon the week before he went to Baltimore. And it was a high-profile event. And when Bill got there to speak, Clinton Frank and Ben Bush had gone to Baltimore to support him. And that was a big moment for, I think, of the character of Bill's ministry, that people would want to do that.
John Frank's father.
Yeah, John Frank's father, right. So we do have the law. Oh, and I did want to say, this is a notebook that Pat put together of news clippings and art pieces of information from that election year. And it belongs to the church. And so Paul's the one who handed it to me, so it'll be somewhere. I don't know where we keep our
It was in the
archives.
credenza. That's where I first.
It was in the credenza. Oh, well, anyway,
There's
we'll,
stuff all over the place in this church.
yeah,
Who knows where it is. How many years was he moderator?
just 1 year. Yep, they changed every year back then, but it was a pivotal year. When, well, okay, David Little, I asked him to comment because David was here when Bill retired. He moved to Keokuk, he and the family moved to Keokuk, Iowa, where he pastored a church for 5 years. And that was to give space to the congregation for him to be gone, and then he could come back as a retired person. So it was a courtesy, it wasn't a rule, but it was good sense. And so I asked David if he would write something. And David in 1970 was a youth pastor in California and took his youth to a synod meeting, and they heard Bill Laws speak. He said, I don't want to read the whole thing, but he said, okay, so the kids are here and this big old guy, you know, looking pretty dull, gets up to speak, and they're just all kind of ready to fall asleep. And then when he talked, it made an impact on all of them, and David never forgot that. Well, how in 1977, David was called here as an associate pastor, and little did he know he would be serving at the church where this was when Warner Bailey came, and so Bill was not on the scene. So he thought it ironic that he'd be serving in the same church where the GA moderator that he had heard had been pastor. By then, he had departed to accept the other call, but later he moved back to Columbus, and that's when I got to know him. I learned early on that during his ministry, he'd attained legendary status as a preacher, pastor, and community leader. He was a big man, not only in stature, but also in influence. He had a booming voice that got your attention, but also the ability to connect with people on a personal level, whether friends or strangers. If he met you on the street, for example, instead of saying, "How are you?" he might say, "How are you deep down?" And he would expect an answer. He was beloved by many and had even earned the respect, albeit sometimes grudging, of those who thought him to be too progressive or too political. He was aware that these perceptions and attachments might make it difficult for his successors following his long pastorate. This was a major decision to go back to Keokuk for a while. Although I didn't work with him on a day-to-day basis after he returned to Columbus, I eventually came to know Bill as a colleague and friend. He worshiped at First Pres on occasion. He also preached often at the little churches out in the countryside and was on speaking gigs, so he wasn't here all the time. But he provided helpful critique, though he wasn't beyond needling me, as you can imagine, with a twinkle in his eye about some minor aspect of the service. More important, he was sensitive to boundary issues and ethical minefields involved in negotiating the relationship between current and former pastors. When a member invited him to officiate at a wedding or a funeral, for example, he would take the occasion as a teaching moment, making it clear to the member that since he was no longer their pastor, they should ask either me or when David became the pastor, the associate, Francis Sunsel, to officiate, and then ask him to help with the service. Meanwhile, the congregation elected Ellen as an elder, and she served on the session for 3 years while I was moderator. Soft-spoken and insightful and gracious, she was a great asset to the session and communicated her support of my leadership in quiet but meaningful ways. When Bill became terminally ill, I visited him in his home, took him communion, and helped him plan his funeral. Listening to him reflect on his life and ministry was a special gift, and when he died in 1985, it was my honor to conduct his funeral, assisted by Francis Sunsel. The sanctuary, the laws room, the gymnasium were filled to capacity with family and friends, people from the community, current and former church members, and representatives from the governing all levels of the Presbyterian Church. Along with the tributes that poured in at his death and the legacy of his ministry, it was a powerful testimony to the man and minister that Bill Laws was. And Mary Ann McCrae was in charge of communion. They had communion at the funeral. She had to borrow communion ware from other churches. I mean, there were people sitting all over. By then, the laws room had been built. So the family decided that gifts that had come in at the time of his death would be used to fund the Laws Lecture series. And I don't know, where's my time going? All right, so the lecture, when we do the Laws Lecture, we always read a little caption about who Bill Laws was, and that's what I had in my hand there. All right. There are quite a few newspaper clippings over the years, and Ellen continued after Bill passed to be involved in the church. I have a Laws Foundation sets an example, and here she is with Reverend Charles Sims, and Ellen was here and involved in the church until she died on July the 19th in 2006. And she was very much a supporter for me and somebody that I treasured in my time at the church. All right, let's have a little bit of time for comments and questions. And Mary Ann says she has a million stories, and you know, I couldn't. Yeah. Mary.
If you speak up, if you could repeat the question.
Okay. So Dale's going to bring the mic around.
How do you want to do it? Just they won't be able to hear it on Zoom as easily, so it would be good if you repeat the question on your lapel mic.
I'm just curious about this space named after him. Was it named after him when it was built, or was that post his passing?
The question is the laws room, the naming of the laws room, and Sherry's got some insight.
Somebody correct me if I'm off kilter, but my recollection, my remembering, I was probably on session at the time. Herb Hoover was a wonderfully committed, strong member of this congregation and deeply appreciative of Bill Laws. And I believe it was when his wife Sally died. Very unfortunately, she took her life. She had been ill. It was a tragedy. And the project was undergoing, and it was going to be called the Hoover Room by the church because the Hoover family was a major contributor to the process. And it was her who said, no, this is not what Sally would want. This is not what the family wants. This is Bill Law's room. So it was named the Law's room, but it was the Hoover family who ended up losing 2 of their 3 sons very tragically. And now Herb is gone, but he's wonderful. And just a happy story about Herb Hoover when the columbarium was coming in. He talked about he wanted his ashes put in the smoking section near David Jones.
Okay.
Just elaborate a little bit to your question. Growing up, this room didn't look at all like this. It was hardwood floor and full of tables, and one of the things that we need to remember about Bill, we have, is that after church on Sunday, there was always adult fellowship gathered around those tables. And he was the principal facilitator of that time together. the coffee hour, it was been called. And one of the other things I think he was known for was he was always here before church to start the coffee.
One of the things that I want to say, and I'm sure Bill Laws would say it, is Bill Laws could only be Bill Laws because of Ellen. She was quite a theologian in herself. I had the privilege of Bible study with her, and she was amazing. But her gift of hospitality.
The story secondhand. It's from my father, who was in Presbytery, had a year's overlap with Bill. And Bill at the time at the Louisville Seminary, which was located down on Broadway Street, right by where the interstate goes to it. Now it's a dental school with the University of Louisville. It was before it moved, the seminary moved out to the eastern part of the city. But he said that even then, he was an older student in the seminary, because at that time it was unusual for anybody to have gone out and done any kind of a job before they went to seminary, because most, himself included, went directly from college into seminary. And he said that Bill was a recognized student leader of all the seminarians at that time, which doesn't surprise me a bit. But so he had been a leader all his life, and he was always challenged people, even in seminary. So just a wonderful memory.
Yeah, I do have a lot of stories about Bill, but and a lot of the things that Janet and you all have recalled, I can remember those things too. When I guess my first recollection of Bill and Ellen and Marty and Ann go back because my family and that family were going up to the same lake, 750 miles from Columbus, Indiana, in northern Wisconsin. And I remember, I was maybe 5 to 6 years older than Marty, but the only church in Cable, Wisconsin was a congregational church. And that's where we were on Sunday mornings, because just because you were on vacation didn't mean you didn't go to church. So those are kind of my early memories. When Bill and Ellen went to Keokuk, and I applaud why they did that, because they wanted to come back here to live, and they knew they had to get away from all of us so that others could lead the church. But so we found out that they were having Bill's last Sunday. He was going to preach, and they were going to have a dinner and so forth, a retirement dinner. So yeah, I rented a van, and I took a group of people, David and Susie Jones, my Methodist mother. I can't remember Jiggs Thompson. I can't remember who else was in the van, but we drove over, but we didn't let the Laws know we were coming. I'm sure we let the Keokuk Presbyterian Church know. And so there we are, sitting there. You know, Bill had a sense of humor. I don't know how he felt about, oh, there are those people from Columbus for worship, but that was a fun thing to do. I know how he brought people to their home for dinner, took care of people. I could just imagine what Marty remembers about people spending the night and so forth. I remember him calling me one time, and he was helping some young man who lived in Elizabethtown. He was concerned about him. And he said, aren't you and your kids needing to go over to Bloomington to some musical or, you know, a ball game or something? And I said, okay. And so we did. We took this young man who was older than my kids at the time. So wonderful people, did a lot of opening our eyes so that we could help people in the community of Columbus and beyond. And for that, I'm grateful. Thank you.
I'll just point out that Mary Ann brought, this is the brochure that was put together to raise funds. George Newland was a part of that for the Laws Lodge, which is on the campus at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary. If you ever want to stay in Louisville for a night, it's open to the public, I believe, and so you might check that out. And then Mary Ann also had an account of the quilt that the women's group made as appreciation to Ellen, and gave it to her, and we're going to find out where it is.
Few more comments and we wrap up.
Just quickly, a way that Bill reached across all religions and beliefs. Many years ago, Hiru Malkani was one of 3 Cummins people killed in a plane accident. And Gay Hoagland, whose husband was part of Cummins, called me in the middle of the night to say this had just happened. And since I was across the street from the family, could I go over and offer support? So I went over to see my friend Sarla and her family, and they were in such deep grief, and I did not know how the Indian faith dealt with death. So I called Bill Laws and asked, could he come and minister to this family, which he immediately did. And as a result of his support and comforting, Sarla asked if our church would hold her husband's ashes for the year until it was time for them to go back to India. And Bill had those ashes placed on the altar, and they stayed there for the year.
So I think we've established that Bill was a leader in the congregation with Ellen in times of strain and confusion and challenge in the United States and in the Columbus community and in our lives. So this is something that was printed in the Presbyterian Outlook. Laws is a new style moderator, and this is what Bill said. Last Sunday, my sermon to my congregation was entitled Reflections of a Monitorial Candidate. And I said to those Presbyterians, don't pray for me, pray for the church. My first sermon upon returning will probably be entitled Reflections of a Recently Elected Moderator. And I'm going to say, keep on praying for the church, but begin to pray for me. So in that spirit, thank you all for coming, and we'll collect always the blessings of the saints who have gone before, and hopefully Bill and Ella's lives inspire us to be even better expressions of Christ's love.
And thank you, Dad.